Your social connections are affecting your physiology right now. Not just your mood, not just your emotional state, but your cardiovascular function, your immune response, your stress hormone levels, and the rate at which your cells are aging. Social connection isn't a luxury or a nice-to-have aspect of life that makes things more pleasant. It's a biological necessity as fundamental to your survival and longevity as nutrition, sleep, and physical activity. And when that need goes unmet, when you become socially isolated or chronically lonely, your body responds with measurable physiological changes that accelerate aging and dramatically increase your risk of early death. The scientific evidence on this is overwhelming and unambiguous. Social isolation and loneliness are as harmful to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. They increase your risk of premature death by 26 to 32%. They increase your risk of heart disease by 29%, your risk of stroke by 32%, and your risk of dementia by 50%. These aren't small effects. These are some of the strongest modifiable risk factors for chronic disease and mortality that we've identified. And yet most people have no idea that their social connections, or lack thereof, are directly affecting how long they'll live and how well they'll age. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly a decade working in AAND, I've seen the downstream consequences of social isolation in the form of preventable chronic disease, cognitive decline, and premature death in people who spent years or decades socially disconnected. My goal now is to help people understand the biological mechanisms through which social connection affects health and longevity, and to provide evidence-based guidance on what you can do to protect yourself. For the next few minutes, we're going to talk about what social isolation actually does to your body at a cellular and systems level, why it's so powerfully predictive of disease and death, and most importantly, what you need to do about it. Defining social isolation versus loneliness. Before we discuss the mechanisms, we need to distinguish between two related but distinct concepts: social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is an objective measure of the quantity of social connections and interactions you have. It's about the size of your social network, the frequency of contact with other people, and whether you live alone or with others. You can measure it objectively by counting how many close relationships you have, how often you interact with friends and family, and how integrated you are into social groups and community activities. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a subjective experience. It's the perceived discrepancy between the social connections you have and the social connections you want. You can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely if those relationships don't provide the emotional intimacy and support you need. Conversely, you can have a small social network but not feel lonely if those few relationships are deeply meaningful and satisfying. Both social isolation and loneliness are harmful to health, but they operate through partially different pathways. Social isolation affects health primarily through lack of practical support, reduced opportunities for physical activity and engagement, and absence of social regulation of health behaviors. Loneliness affects health primarily through chronic stress activation, dysregulated inflammatory responses, and impaired sleep quality. The worst scenario is when both are present simultaneously, which unfortunately is increasingly common in modern societies. You're living alone, you have infrequent social contact, and you feel a painful sense of disconnection and lack of belonging. This combination creates a perfect storm of physiological dysfunction that accelerates aging and disease. The prevalence of social isolation and loneliness has been increasing steadily over the past several decades. In the United Kingdom, approximately 9% of adults report feeling lonely often or always, and this percentage is even higher among older adults and young adults aged 18 to 24. In the United States, surveys show that roughly 1 in 3 adults aged 45 and older report feeling lonely, and 1 in 4 adults aged 65 and older are considered socially isolated. These numbers have worsened dramatically during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, with lockdowns and social distancing measures exacerbating pre-existing trends towards social disconnection. The public health implications are staggering. We're looking at millions of people whose health is being significantly compromised by inadequate social connection, and most of them don't realize it's happening or don't understand the magnitude of the risk. Mechanism 1. Chronic stress activation. The first mechanism through which social isolation shortens lifespan is chronic activation of stress response systems. Human beings evolved as intensely social creatures. For most of our evolutionary history, being separated from the group meant immediate danger. Isolation meant vulnerability to predators, inability to acquire food, and reduced chances of survival and reproduction. Your nervous system is wired to interpret social disconnection as a threat, and it responds by activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the sympathetic nervous system. When you're lonely or socially isolated, your body produces elevated levels of stress hormones, particularly cortisol. In acute situations, this stress response is adaptive. It mobilizes energy, sharpens focus, and prepares you to deal with threats. But when loneliness is chronic, when it persists day after day for months or years, the stress response doesn't turn off. You end up with chronically elevated cortisol and persistent sympathetic nervous system activation. Chronic cortisol elevation has wide-ranging harmful effects. It promotes abdominal fat accumulation, which is the most metabolically harmful type of fat storage. It impairs glucose metabolism and contributes to insulin resistance and diabetes. It suppresses immune function, making you more susceptible to infections and reducing your ability to fight cancer cells. It impairs memory formation and accelerates cognitive decline by damaging the hippocampus. It disrupts sleep architecture, reducing deep sleep and REM sleep, which are essential for physical and cognitive recovery. Chronic sympathetic activation increases heart rate and blood pressure, forcing your cardiovascular system to work harder continuously. It promotes inflammation throughout the body. It impairs digestion and gut function. Over years and decades, this persistent physiological stress state breaks down multiple organ systems and accelerates the aging process. Mechanism 2. Systemic inflammation. The second mechanism is chronic systemic inflammation. Social isolation and loneliness are associated with elevated levels of inflammatory markers, including C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. This isn't just a correlational finding. Experimental studies have shown that inducing feelings of social exclusion in laboratory settings causes measurable increases in inflammatory gene expression within hours. The relationship appears to be bidirectional and self-reinforcing. Loneliness triggers inflammation, and inflammation affects the brain in ways that make social connection more difficult and less rewarding, creating a vicious cycle. The inflammatory response to social isolation appears to be an evolutionary adaptation. When our ancestors were isolated from the group, they faced increased risk of physical injury from predators or hostile encounters. The immune system responded by upregulating inflammatory processes to enhance wound healing and fight infection. This was adaptive in the short term, but becomes maladaptive when the perceived threat is chronic social disconnection rather than acute physical danger. Chronic inflammation is one of the most powerful drivers of aging and age-related disease. It damages blood vessel walls and promotes atherosclerosis, leading to heart attacks and strokes. It breaks down joint cartilage and causes arthritis. It impairs insulin signaling and contributes to diabetes. It damages neurons and accelerates cognitive decline and dementia. It promotes cancer development and progression by creating a microenvironment that supports tumor growth. The inflammatory burden created by chronic loneliness and social isolation contributes directly to all of these disease processes and shortens lifespan through multiple pathways. Mechanism 3. Impaired immune function. The third mechanism involves dysregulation of immune function. Social isolation affects both arms of the immune system in ways that make you more vulnerable to disease. On one hand, as we just discussed, there's upregulation of inflammatory responses, particularly the pro-inflammatory gene expression programs controlled by NF-kappa B signaling. This creates chronic inflammation that damages tissues. On the other hand, there's downregulation of antiviral immune responses and antibody production. Studies have shown that socially isolated individuals have reduced expression of genes involved in interferon signaling and antibody production, making them more susceptible to viral infections. The combination is particularly harmful. You have an overactive inflammatory response that causes tissue damage, combined with an underactive antiviral response that allows infections to take hold more easily and persist longer. This explains why socially isolated people have higher rates of infections, longer recovery times when they do get sick, and poorer responses to vaccinations. Several studies have demonstrated that lonely individuals produce fewer antibodies in response to flu vaccines compared to well-connected individuals, meaning the vaccine is less effective at protecting them. The immune dysregulation extends to cancer surveillance as well. Natural killer cells, which are a type of immune cell that identifies and destroys cancer cells and virus-infected cells, show reduced activity in chronically lonely individuals. This impaired immune surveillance may contribute to the increased cancer risk associated with social isolation. Your immune system is supposed to identify and eliminate abnormal cells before they can develop into tumors. When that surveillance mechanism is compromised by chronic stress and loneliness, cancer development becomes more likely. Mechanism 4. Cardiovascular dysfunction. The fourth mechanism is direct cardiovascular dysfunction. Social isolation and loneliness increase heart disease and stroke risk through multiple interconnected pathways. First, through the chronic stress activation we discussed earlier. Elevated cortisol and sympathetic tone increase heart rate, blood pressure, and vascular resistance, forcing the cardiovascular system to work harder continuously. This accelerates wear and tear on the heart and blood vessels. Second, through inflammation. The elevated inflammatory markers associated with loneliness damage the endothelium, which is the inner lining of blood vessels. This endothelial dysfunction reduces nitric oxide production, impairs the vessel's ability to dilate properly, and promotes the formation of atherosclerotic plaques. Third, through dysregulated autonomic function. Social connection is associated with higher heart rate variability, which is a marker of healthy autonomic nervous system function and strong parasympathetic tone. Social isolation is associated with reduced heart rate variability, indicating impaired autonomic regulation and increased cardiovascular risk. Fourth, through behavioral pathways. Socially isolated individuals are more likely to smoke, more likely to be physically inactive, more likely to have poor dietary habits, and less likely to adhere to medication regimens for chronic conditions. The absence of social support and social modeling of healthy behaviors contributes to worse health outcomes. The cumulative effect of these pathways is substantial. Meta-analyses of prospective cohort studies have consistently shown that social isolation and loneliness increase the risk of coronary heart disease by approximately 29%, and the risk of stroke by 32%. These are risks comparable to well-established cardiovascular risk factors like obesity and physical inactivity. If you're socially isolated, you're putting your cardiovascular system under chronic strain that will accelerate disease development and increase your risk of heart attacks and strokes. Now, if you're concerned about your own social connections or those of someone you care about, and you want to learn evidence-based strategies for building and maintaining meaningful social relationships that support longevity, please consider subscribing to this channel. I promise to keep creating content grounded in rigorous science to help you prevent disease and live longer, healthier lives. All I ask is that you give this channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you reach the end of this video and didn't find it valuable, you can unsubscribe at any time. But if you give me your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine and extensive study of longevity research. So please help me reach more people by subscribing, and let's continue with the video. Mechanism 5. Accelerated cognitive decline. The fifth mechanism is accelerated cognitive decline and increased dementia risk. The evidence linking social isolation to cognitive impairment is particularly strong and concerning. Multiple large longitudinal studies have shown that socially isolated older adults experience faster rates of cognitive decline and have approximately 50% higher risk of developing dementia compared to well-connected individuals. The mechanisms are multifactorial. First, social interaction is cognitively stimulating. Conversation requires you to process language, retrieve memories, consider other perspectives, regulate emotions, and engage executive functions. Regular social engagement provides consistent cognitive exercise that maintains neural networks and builds cognitive reserve. When you're socially isolated, you lose that ongoing cognitive stimulation, and neural pathways that aren't being used actively begin to atrophy. Second, the chronic stress and inflammation associated with loneliness directly damage brain structures. Elevated cortisol damages the hippocampus, which is critical for memory formation. Chronic inflammation promotes neuroinflammation, which contributes to neuronal death and the accumulation of pathological proteins like amyloid and tau that characterize Alzheimer's disease. Third, social isolation is associated with worse sleep quality, and poor sleep impairs the brain's glymphatic system, which is responsible for clearing metabolic waste products during sleep. When this clearance system doesn't function properly, toxic proteins accumulate in the brain and contribute to neurodegeneration. Fourth, socially isolated individuals have higher rates of depression, and depression is itself a significant risk factor for dementia. The relationship is likely bidirectional, with depression contributing to social withdrawal, which then worsens depression, creating a downward spiral. The cognitive effects of social isolation aren't limited to older adults. Even in younger populations, loneliness is associated with impaired cognitive performance, reduced attention and concentration, and structural brain changes visible on MRI scans. Protecting your cognitive function and reducing dementia risk requires maintaining strong social connections throughout your life, not just in old age. Mechanism 6. Health behavior pathways. The sixth mechanism operates through health behaviors. Social connections influence health behaviors in multiple ways. First, through social support. When you have close relationships, people notice if you're not taking care of yourself and can encourage you to seek medical care, take medications as prescribed, or make healthier choices. Socially isolated individuals are less likely to have someone noticing and intervening when health problems develop. Second, through social modeling and norms, you tend to adopt the behaviors of the people around you. If your social network includes people who exercise regularly, eat well, and avoid smoking, you're more likely to do the same. If you're isolated, you lose that positive modeling effect. Third, through motivation and accountability. Social commitments create structure and motivation. Having a friend to meet for a walk creates accountability that makes you more likely to actually go for that walk. Without those social commitments, it's easier to slip into sedentary and unhealthy patterns. Studies have documented that socially isolated individuals have higher rates of smoking, higher alcohol consumption, lower levels of physical activity, poorer dietary quality, and worse medication adherence. These behavioral differences partially mediate the relationship between social isolation and health outcomes, though the direct physiological pathways we discussed earlier also play a major independent role. The practical implication is that maintaining social connections not only provides direct biological benefits, but also supports the health behaviors that prevent disease and promote longevity. What I see in emergency medicine, in the emergency department, I see the consequences of social isolation regularly, though it's rarely listed as the primary problem. I see elderly patients who live alone, who haven't spoken to anyone in days, who have no one to notice when they're unwell until things have progressed to a crisis. I see people coming in with heart attacks, strokes, diabetic emergencies, and when we take their social history, we find they're profoundly isolated. No close friends, estranged from family, no community connections. They're dealing with chronic health conditions but have no social support network to help them manage medications, attend appointments, or recognize warning signs. I see the accelerated cognitive decline in isolated older adults who come in confused or delirious, and when we investigate, we find they've been living alone with minimal social contact for years. Their cognitive function has deteriorated in that isolation. What's particularly tragic is how often this isolation is invisible. These patients don't come in saying they're lonely or socially disconnected. They come in with the physical manifestations of chronic disease that's been accelerated by years of physiological stress from isolation. The social disconnection is a hidden contributor that's rarely addressed even when it's clearly present. And even when we do identify it, there's often little we can do in the acute setting, beyond treat the immediate medical problem and send them back to the same isolated circumstances that contributed to the crisis in the first place. Building and maintaining social connection. So what do you do if you recognize that you're socially isolated or chronically lonely? The first step is to acknowledge that this is a serious health issue that deserves attention and active intervention. Social connection isn't optional or frivolous. It's as important to your health as diet and exercise. The second step is to understand that quality matters more than quantity. You don't need dozens of acquaintances or a massive social network. What matters is having a few meaningful relationships characterized by mutual trust, emotional support, and regular contact. Research suggests that having 3 to 5 close relationships that you interact with regularly provides most of the health benefits of social connection. The third step is to take concrete action to build and maintain connections. This might mean reconnecting with old friends or family members you've lost touch with. It might mean joining groups or organizations aligned with your interests where you can meet like-minded people. Community groups, volunteer organizations, religious congregations, hobby clubs, fitness classes, all of these provide opportunities for regular social interaction around shared activities. It might mean being more intentional about deepening existing relationships by moving beyond superficial interactions to share more meaningful conversation and mutual support. The fourth step is to prioritize face-to-face interaction when possible. While digital communication and social media can help maintain connections, research suggests that in-person interaction provides stronger health benefits, likely because it involves richer communication through body language, eye contact, and physical presence. Video calls are better than phone calls, and phone calls are better than text messages, but nothing fully replaces being physically present with another person. The fifth step is to recognize that building meaningful relationships takes time and consistent effort. You can't expect to solve chronic loneliness with a single intervention. It requires showing up regularly, being vulnerable and authentic, offering support to others, and allowing relationships to deepen gradually over months and years. For those who struggle with social anxiety or find social interaction difficult, starting small is perfectly acceptable. Begin with low-stakes, structured social activities where the focus is on a shared task or interest rather than pure socializing. Volunteering is particularly effective because it provides purpose, regular contact with others, and a context where social interaction happens naturally around meaningful work. For older adults or those with mobility limitations, transportation can be a barrier to social connection. Community programs that provide transport to social activities, home visiting services, and technology that enables video calls with family can all help maintain connection when getting out becomes difficult. Final thought: social isolation and loneliness are quietly robbing millions of people of years of life. The physiological mechanisms are well understood: chronic stress activation, systemic inflammation, immune dysregulation, cardiovascular dysfunction, accelerated cognitive decline, and impaired health behaviors all contribute to dramatically increased risk of disease and premature death. The magnitude of the risk is comparable to smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. This isn't a minor lifestyle factor. This is one of the most powerful determinants of how long you'll live and how well you'll age. Yet it receives a fraction of the attention and resources devoted to other health risk factors. The good news is that social connection is modifiable. You can take action to build and strengthen your relationships. You can join groups and communities. You can reach out to people you've lost touch with. You can prioritize face-to-face interaction and invest time in deepening meaningful connections. And when you do, the benefits extend far beyond just feeling less lonely. You're reducing chronic stress, lowering inflammation, supporting immune function, protecting cardiovascular health, maintaining cognitive function, and adding years to your life. Your relationships aren't separate from your health. They're fundamental to your health. Treat them accordingly. And finally, if you found this video valuable and want to continue learning about evidence-based strategies to prevent disease and extend your health span, please subscribe to this channel. I'll keep creating content to help you live longer, healthier lives grounded in rigorous science. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.